Tundra Connections Webcast. We are live on Tundra Buggy 1 near Churchill, Manitoba on the shores of Hudson Bay, and there are polar bears just outside our window, and we will show you some polar bears very soon. First, I want to introduce myself. My name is Elisa, and I work for Polar Bears International, and I get to host these wonderful Tundra Connections webcasts. We are so excited that you are joining us today. Today, we will be talking about being at the top of the world with polar bears. So for the next about half an hour, it's all about what is life like in the Arctic, how do polar bears live in the Arctic, and what else is up here in the Arctic, and how, no matter where you live, does the Arctic affect you? So we've got lots of fun stuff to talk about, and during our chatting, we will be mixing in some really cool images and photos and even polar bear footage from right outside where we are right now. So definitely keep an eye out for all that. I first want to introduce my colleague behind the scenes. We have BJ Kirschoffer, who's running this whole program right now. So you can't see him on camera at the moment, but he's going to make this webcast happen. And if we need BJ to show something, we're going to call out to him, so you might hear us do that. But I'm also joined by a couple other excellent guests up here right now. So every week we bring up new people that have different expertise and study different things in the Arctic, and we have, some special people here today. So we've got Flavio and Jody, and I'll let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do. Maybe Flavio, you could go first.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Elisa, and hi everyone. My name is Flavio. I'm a climate scientist, so that means I study the weather and the climate of the entire globe, but the Arctic in particular as well. I live in the United States, in Colorado, next to some beautiful mountains, but I'm really excited to be out here in the Arctic. This is an environment like nothing else, and so I'm just excited to be here and talk to you guys today about the Arctic environment.
Thank you. Jody?
Hi everybody, I'm Jody and I live in Edmonton, Canada, and I get to study polar bears every day. So I think I have the coolest job. I get to think about polar bears and seals from the time I wake up until the time I have dinner, which is pretty awesome. And I'm excited to be up here with you guys.
Super awesome. Thanks, Jody. So we really want to hear your questions today. We want to be able to answer anything you want to know about polar bears or sea ice or climate or seals or even some other Arctic critters. So if you do have questions, please ask your teacher or yourselves. You can email us at questions@pbears.org. So that's questions@pbears.org, pretty easy. Or there is a chat window right under where you're watching us today if you are on our webpage. So plunk your questions in there. Or maybe you are on our Facebook page, so someone is also monitoring Facebook. So let us know what you want to talk about, and we'll answer your questions throughout the broadcast. Okay, so let's get started about the Arctic. First of all, what is the Arctic? What actually defines the Arctic? Flavio, could you tell us?
Sure, yeah. So as you've sort of guessed from the title of our today's webcast, the Arctic is really on top of the world. So if you live in the United States or Canada, but really also if you live in Europe, if you just go north from wherever your house is, and you keep going, you'll eventually end up in the Arctic. It's really where the North Pole is. And the Arctic is, we'll talk a little bit about this more later, how cold it is there and why it's cold there, but it's defined in various ways. It can be defined as a region that is particularly cold, high up there in the north. It can be defined as a region where it's completely dark in winter, where there's no sunshine. That's a pretty incredible thing to wrap your head around, that there is a whole period of the year in this region where there is no sunshine. And another thing that I think is actually really interesting about the Arctic and the name of the Arctic, where it's coming from, I think it comes from the Greek term Arctos or something. And what that means, if you try to translate it in, for example, English, is that it's a region that is close to the Great Bear. It refers to sort of a solar constellation, but still it's really great to have a name that is associated with the polar bear that we're going to talk about a little more today. That's really the Arctic, the Arctic region.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the Arctic is a pretty special place, very cold. Part of the reason we wear toques and coats even when we're indoors here. We are coming to you from a Tundra buggy that we roam around in all day. So we're in this mobile roaming broadcast studio looking for polar bears. And BJ just showed you a little peek outside, what it looks like out there right now. The winds are howling. We had a big snowstorm last night, and there is a polar bear sleeping in some bushes a little ways away. So we'll keep an eye on him to see if he picks his head up. But Flavio just mentioned the Arctic and how cold it is up there. One of the super cool things about the Arctic is that the ocean freezes up in the north. So we have frozen ocean water, which is pretty cool because it's not just like your average maybe frozen lake you might go skating on or frozen ice cubes in your drink. Sea ice is pretty cool. Jody, could you tell us a little bit about sea ice and its role in the Arctic ecosystem?
Yeah, I would love to, Elisa. The more I learn about sea ice, the more cool I think it is. Not to make a pun, but it's very cool. Yeah, and if you want to see how different sea ice is from just normal ice, you can do an experiment we have going on right now in our fridge or in your freezer, and you can freeze just some normal water out of the tap, or water that you mix in just a couple teaspoons of salt, and you can look at how different they look. When you look at them, you can see it. If you touch them, you can feel it. And those differences are what makes all the difference out here. And that's why lakes aren't the same as the ocean, for example. And so when the ocean freezes, when salt water freezes, inside of that there's all these little tiny spaces, and in those spaces things can grow. So we like to think of the sea ice as the soil of the Arctic Ocean. And it really just creates a whole garden underneath there. I think BJ's got a footage, yeah, there you go, of green things growing underneath that ice. So on the top it looks really white and dead, and you might think nothing grows here, it's just cold. But on the bottom you have all kinds of plants, and that starts the whole food web from the bottom all the way up to the polar bear. So it's a pretty incredible landscape that houses a bunch of really interesting, unique creatures.
That is so interesting. The food chain in the Arctic is so cool because we really don't get to see a lot of what's going on underneath the water there. So BJ is showing you a quick animation here. And tomorrow we have a webcast where we'll talk a little bit more about the ecosystem, but you can see that it's not just the polar bear that relies on sea ice. There are a lot of things under the ocean and feeding on each other all the way up the food chain that really need that sea ice. So one question about the Arctic is, how cold does it actually get in the Arctic? Flavio, do you know how cold it even gets?
Well, we have measurements in a variety of places, but not everywhere, and it gets pretty cold. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all this ice and snow up here that we see around us and in some of the clips we've seen. It goes below freezing, so obviously, and some of the coldest temperatures that are recorded in the Arctic are on the order of minus 30 to minus 40 degrees Celsius. One thing that is really important to consider, not just in the Arctic, but whenever you go out in winter, is the wind. So when it's really windy, it feels much colder than just the temperature of the air itself. And so a critical component about how cold you feel and how quickly there is sea ice forming is really also how windy it is. And the Arctic is a pretty wild place. It's not only cold, it's pretty windy. We see that out here all the time. This morning we had basically a snowstorm going on around our buggy. So it's really, really cold place.
Yeah, and you are not, that wind does get you. It can be a really nice day, and as soon as the wind picks up, it is freezing. And that makes it even more amazing that polar bears can make a living in the Arctic. And in fact, they love the Arctic. They're adapted for the Arctic. They live in some of the harshest places on Earth. It gets so cold. They go swimming, so it's wet and cold. And how on earth does this bear actually live in the Arctic and do really, really well at it? We are going to talk to you a little bit about how polar bears live in the Arctic. So I think BJ is showing you right here. We still have our sleeping friend out by the bushes. One of the things that we see where we are right now, so the Arctic is a big place, and Churchill is technically, I'll let you in on a little secret, we are in the sub-Arctic right now, so we're just below the Arctic. But these bears right here come on shore when there's no sea ice, and they have to rest because they're not eating as much. They have to conserve their energy. They're waiting for the sea ice to come back because sea ice means that polar bears can go out and start hunting their favorite food, seals. And we see that a lot of their adaptations are very much for polar bears to live in the cold and to hunt seals. So there's an example of a bearded seal right there. And polar bears need seals because seals have lots of blubber And blubber has lots of calories. So polar bears need to eat way more than any other bear species. They need to just pile on the blubber. They have to eat, and that's how they get big, and that's how they get a lot of insulation in the Arctic, and that's how they keep going. So even though we see them on land now, they won't be on for much longer. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about some of the adaptations that polar bears have on sea ice. And maybe we could start with one adaptation, their fur. BJ, if you could pull up the fur image. So we're going to give you guys a few seconds. So if you look at this polar bear and think about its fur, and you might hear Tundra buggy rolling by in the background, what do you think it is about the fur that helps polar bears live in the Arctic? There's actually a few things. So we'll give you a few seconds to talk amongst your class. And please do remember that if you have any questions, you can email us at questions@pbears.org, or pop your questions in the chat window, or put them in our Facebook page. So think about the polar bear's fur. That looks pretty cold, but the polar bear looks pretty happy. All right, so we have even a couple examples, so I'll hand a piece off to Jody. Jody, do you mind telling us a couple things about polar bear fur that helps keep them warm in the Arctic?
For sure. So here we've got a piece of real polar bear fur. It's not very soft, actually. It's not as soft as you might think when you want to cuddle them. But if you look inside the fur, there's 2 layers. So on the inside, really close to the bear's skin, yeah, if you can see that there, that stuff is more fluffy, and it's kind of like wearing a really cozy, warm sweater. So that keeps the bear nice and warm, really close. And then on the top, we have these kind of longer hairs. And these ones are more like the bear's putting on like a waterproof rain jacket or something. Those ones help the bear to stay dry, and they keep that kind of sweater hair underneath dry and fluffy. So there's a really cool 2-layer system going on with the polar bear hair.
Very cool.
Cool.
Another cool thing about polar bear hair is that even though it looks white to us, it's actually clear and it's hollow. So if you were to get it's called an electron microscope, or a really good magnifying glass, like in a microscope, and you were to cut a hair in half, you'd see that it's actually kind of hollow, and that helps trap warm air closer to the polar bear's body. And they just look white to our eyes because the hair is reflecting all the light away, so our eyes pick them up as white, which is pretty cool. And of course, it helps them camouflage into their sea ice background and kind of blend in with the ice and snow, which helps them sneak up on their seal prey. So polar bears have a couple ways they hunt seals. All the ways involve sea ice. So polar bears are very good swimmers, but they can't outswim a seal in the water. If you think of us trying to catch a fish by swimming around in the water with our bare hands, it's just not going to go as well as if we're standing on something more stable and using something else to catch that fish. And polar bears have their own method. They do one thing that we call still hunting. So when a seal comes up to breathe air, because seals are mammals, so they swim around in the ocean, and they maintain some breathing holes. So they carve holes into the ice that they can come out of and breathe air. And seals have to breathe air, so polar bears will wait by a seal hole, and when a seal does come up, a polar bear will pounce into the seal hole and grab that seal after being very patient. Sometimes they use the sea ice to sneak up on a seal instead, but the important thing to know is they really do need ice to help them hunt seals. And we do see parts of their body that show us that they really need to hunt seals. They are much more carnivorous, or much more inclined to eat meat and fat than other bears. And I might pass this claw to Jody, and maybe she could point out a couple things about their claw that makes it better for them to hunt seals.
Yeah, so here we have a real polar bear claw, which is pretty cool, kind of sharp. You want to be careful with that. And if you could compare this to a claw from a different bear, you'd see the most differences. So grizzly bears or black bears, the way that they eat is they need to dig in the dirt, or they're going through bushes to get berries or something. But polar bears are catching living things. They need to be able to hook a seal out of the ice. And so the claw is super rounded. You can see it comes to a really sharp, pointy tip, and it's really good for grabbing things, and also for grabbing onto the sea ice. If you try walking on ice, you might notice it's a bit slippery. And the polar bears have the same problem. And so they've adapted ways to deal with that. So they have these really grippy claws, and also the bottom of their feet have little black dots on them. And so these black dots act kind of like little grippy, like the treads of a tire or the bottom of your boots that help you not slip around on the ice, so that the bears aren't just falling all over the place, not doing anything.
That would be difficult.
But funny, but difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And some of you may have noticed that we do have a skull with us right here. So we would be remiss to not show you the skull. Maybe Flavio, you can help us demonstrate the skull on our little prop table here. And I can hold the skull. And maybe Flavio, you can be a seal for me
I'm
for a
happy
second.
to be a seal. Yeah. Seals seem pretty happy out there until they meet the polar bear.
Yeah, they do for sure.
So I'm just a seal on
Yeah.
a piece of sea ice, I guess.
Yep. I like that. You can see polar bears have very, very sharp claws, and they have a nice smooth head that will help them get into a seal hole, and then they will grab their seal prey just like that and pull the head out of the water. So polar bears are very well adapted to using sea ice and jumping in these holes to hunt seals. And they just, they really do need to live in the Arctic. What we're seeing here outside our window is hopefully I didn't scratch your head with a bear
It was
teeth.
just very scary.
Okay, it was very scary. I'm glad we're okay. So what we see in Churchill here is really unique that we can get so close to polar bears, but it's really kind of like you maybe being at school, like if someone were to come meet you and see you in school and they just assume that you lived there your entire life, that wouldn't be true, because much of your life is lived at home and doing activities and doing other, the things you maybe want to be doing even a little more, even though school is really cool. Well, if we see polar bears here, it's really a different kind of environment for them. They want to be out on the sea ice. They'd rather be doing what they want to do, which is out hunting seals. So we are just really lucky that we get to see them here. But one thing that's happening to polar bears is that they, in some areas, don't have as much access to their sea ice habitat as they used to. And this just means that they're losing some hunting opportunities, so maybe they're not eating as much. And Flavio, I was wondering if you could kind of talk about maybe what's going on in the Arctic broadly with sea ice, what we're seeing happen.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. I mean, we've been... climate scientists have been observing sea ice for a long time, but the really good measurements that we have are starting when we started having satellite data in the 1980s. And we've been noticing that there is less and less sea ice, both in terms of like the area that it covers. So that's just talking about like how much area is covered by sea ice, but then also the thickness of the sea ice has been decreasing quite a bit since we have been able to make these measurements. So that's something that we see essentially almost everywhere where there is sea ice on an annual basis. And it's a pretty strong trend. So it's really like we're talking about anywhere between 40 and 50% of the sea ice that we've seen when we started taking measurements has been lost essentially. And some regions have like a stronger trend than others, but the point is really that across the entire Arctic regions, we see that there's less sea ice every year, essentially. So that's sort of the big picture. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's not just polar bears that rely on sea ice. We showed you earlier the Arctic ecosystem, but there's other creatures even beyond what we showed you that do rely on sea ice. And maybe each of our panelists can talk about one Arctic animal that needs sea ice in a certain way. We can let this image play out if you'd like. It's a really interesting sea ice age image. Thanks, BJ. Okay, so Jody, what is an Arctic animal that you like to talk about?
So obviously polar bears, but if I can't talk about polar bears, I'll talk about Arctic foxes. So Arctic foxes are adorable, but they also really like polar bears because when the polar bears kill a seal on the ice and the polar bear's done with it, and maybe he goes to take a nap, then the fox can come in and he can do a lot of cleaning up of the little bits and pieces. So Arctic foxes have a good relationship with polar bears in that they can eat their leftovers.
Yum.
Pretty cool.
That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Flavio, what's one of your favorite Arctic animals?
I really like the walrus, besides the polar
yeah.
bear. It's just a very impressive animal. We all know it for its impressive tusks, these huge, essentially long teeth that come out of its mouth, and then also the whiskers. But what I'm really impressed by is the sheer size. So some of these walruses can be as heavy as 4,000 kilograms, 2,000 kilograms, 4,000 pounds or something, depending on which unit you prefer. And to give you a sense how like heavy these animals are, that can be, as far as I understand, almost twice as heavy as a polar bear. So that's really showing you like the impressive size of this animal. And it also needs sea ice for in its habitat to really thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. They think they use platforms to rest on after they're done kind of scavenging for mollusks underneath the water. Yeah, and polar bears, I think there's footage out there of them trying to hunt a walrus, but the walrus are actually so big that even though they're a great source of blubber, polar bears can rarely actually get at that food source. One cool thing about the walrus is that explore.org, who's a huge partner of ours on getting this polar bear cam out, they also do have a walrus cam, so check that out if you're interested. And one of my favorite Arctic species besides the polar bear also has an explore.org cam, which is the beluga. And so we run a beluga cam in Churchill as well every summer. So check it out in July and August next year. And we get footage of beluga underneath the water. You can hear them singing. You can watch the babies and the families. It is just pretty cool. And beluga, they need sea ice too because it gives them protection. You'll notice on that beluga, it does not have a fin on its back. There's no dorsal fin. And that's something that we see in Arctic whales. This helps them get right up close to the sea ice because there's no fin blocking their way. But one of the predators of these animals is the orca or the killer whale. And those whales do have a dorsal fin. So if there are orcas in the area, the beluga can hide amongst the sea ice and they are less likely to get maybe eaten by an orca whale who can't make it in the sea ice. So as we're losing sea ice in the Arctic, we do see killer whales coming in more often to these areas where they didn't used to be, and they are eating these animals that are not used to having to worry about killer whales, and we're seeing these changes in the ecosystem, and it's just, it's really interesting to watch, but it is worrisome because even though there are all these animals that depend on Arctic sea ice, humans depend on Arctic sea ice too. So it's not just about animals, it's about us. Sea ice is like the Earth's air conditioner. It helps keep us cool all around the world by reflecting sunlight away from the Earth. It is just so important to all of us that we have it to regulate our climate, but also even for the people that live in the Arctic. The sea ice can act like their highway. It's their transportation. It's their access to food. The ocean is like the garden for folks that live up here. It's really the source of a lot of their own calories, similar to the polar bear. So when you lose sea ice, you're losing access to food and your normal way of life, and that's not good, but the good thing is that there are things we can do to help. So we'll tell you a little bit about what's actually going on in the Arctic, and in a moment here, BJ can pull up maybe that animation that we have.
Sea ice in the Arctic is disappearing. Why is this happening? When we burn fossil fuels for energy, we add more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Regular carbon dioxide is used and created by normal life processes, like photosynthesis and breathing. But rampant carbon dioxide comes from burning fossil fuels for energy. The excess carbon dioxide builds up like a thick blanket that traps the Earth's heat and disrupts the climate. Too much heat messes with the Earth's climate. A warmer world has lots of consequences. One consequence is a warmer Arctic with less and less sea ice.
So, Flavio, if we were to lose sea ice or lose too much sea ice, what would that mean for all of us?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and me and my colleagues spend a great deal of our time trying to find out what that means. So we're basically trying to understand what's going to happen as we lose more sea ice. And you've already touched upon one important point, that sea ice is very white, like snow, and so it reflects a lot of the sunlight. So if we lose it, the Earth will take up more energy than it used to. And we can actually already see that and measure it with our instruments. So the Arctic is the fastest warming place in the world. It's warming about twice as fast as the rest of the globe, and in part because it's losing its ice and its snow so rapidly that it's really taking up a lot more of the radiation that is warming it up. The other thing that we're currently working on as scientists is trying to understand if changes in the Arctic are having consequences for the weather elsewhere. So where people live in the United States, in Europe, and there is a lot of interesting work going on. We're not 100% sure yet, but if indeed the Arctic changes and affects the weather elsewhere, it would be a pretty big deal, because then we'd really have to study it more carefully to understand what it means for where most of the people live in Europe, North America, Asia, and so forth.
Right. So it is really important that we keep sea ice in the Arctic. In places where we have lost some sea ice already, so for example, where we are right now in western Hudson Bay, polar bears here have sea ice for 4 weeks less than they used to. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but because there's less sea ice, they're not hunting as much and not getting quite as many calories. And so there are actually 30% fewer polar bears here than there were 40 years ago. We have seen this population decline, but we want to make sure that we prevent that and that we can keep polar bears in the Arctic always. And there are absolutely solutions. So we have a responsibility to protect polar bears, and the best way to do this is to protect their sea ice. Saving sea ice means keeping the Earth cool enough that plenty of sea ice can form each year. So if you remember the gas called carbon dioxide that forms an invisible blanket that traps heat around the Earth, we can keep that blanket of carbon dioxide from getting thicker by using more energy from nature, like the sun, wind, and water. It's important that we look for ways to use more energy from nature in our neighborhoods. So you can ask your teachers and parents what type of energy is used to heat and cool your school and your home. Give the adults in your life some homework to learn about different sources of energy like wind power and water power, and see what can happen in your own community. Many families are making choices that change where the energy for their neighborhoods comes from. And even some of our polar bear camps out here run on solar and wind power. So these are all great steps toward protecting sea ice that polar bears need and that humans need. It's good for polar bears, our planet, and the future protection of all of us. So we really encourage you to get involved however you can, and to let us know what you're doing, because we love highlighting that. And at the end of our program here in a few minutes, we're going to play a really fun video showing you what some kids over in Spain are doing. But before we wrap up, we're just going to take a couple questions that came in while we were chatting. So Jody, how did you feel when you saw your first polar bear?
Honestly, I felt a little bit cold. It was very cold outside, and I thought, oh, thank goodness. Because when we work on polar bears, I should say, we have to put the polar bears to sleep. So we tranquilize them, because working on polar bears otherwise is a little bit too dangerous, and you wouldn't have very many scientists left. And so the polar bear was put to sleep, and so we tranquilized. And I thought, good, now I can put my hands in its fur and warm up my hands. But it turns out the polar bears are so well insulated, I put my hands in its armpits and it was still cold. So I felt really excited and also a bit cold.
It was keeping all its heat for itself.
Yeah, it wasn't going to share.
Oh, too funny. We also have a question coming in from Facebook. So polar bears do have time left, and that's a really good question to ask. Absolutely, time remains to help protect polar bears. The really cool thing about sea ice is that it's very responsive to temperature changes in our atmosphere and in our ocean. So we know that once we can get rid of the excess carbon dioxide, we will see sea ice come back and stabilize. But there is a bit of a lag time, and that's why we need to act now. It's better that we work to protect ice now before it's too late, because we can't just put a fence around it to help protect it, and we can't grow more of it when we want. So if we're all working together on better energy solutions now and asking our civic leaders to do something about carbon dioxide and just to protect our environment for future generations, that's how we'll make sure that we protect sea ice, polar bears, and people that live all across the world. So thank you so much for everyone joining us today. That is about half an hour. So we'll start wrapping up. We can do lots of things to influence where our energy comes from. And if you're looking for more ways to get involved, please check out the Get Involved section of the polarbearsinternational.org website. Whether you're a teacher, a parent, a student, or just a concerned citizen, we've got all sorts of different ways that anyone can make a difference for whatever works for you in your family, in your neighborhood, and at your school or business. So please do check that out. We are also working on getting feedback for this program. So if you are a teacher or anyone watching today, there is a link at the bottom of your page for a feedback a survey you can fill out. Everyone that takes the feedback survey will get a link to all sorts of online assets that aren't available on our website yet, so you'll get some cool images and fun activities, and you'll be entered into a draw to win one of 3 cub adoptions. So your class could win a cub adoption and have a little classroom mascot, which would be super fun, and we would just love you to enter the draw and win one of these cubs, which would be really, really great. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. This was our first Tundra Connections webcast of the year. We're going to have many more, and we're running the Polar Bear Cam every day. So check us out and ask questions anytime. Send them in at any point and we'll get to them. And check out our website online for the schedule of upcoming webcasts. We do have one tomorrow looking at the Arctic ecosystem. It will be really fun. And maybe to wrap up, BJ can play the wonderful class we have from Spain. This is an example of one of our Project Polar Bear groups that did a wonderful class project and then sent us this video, and it's just really inspiring way to show how people can bond together and help protect polar bears. So thank you so much. Thanks to our guests. Thank you to Frontiers North Adventures for loaning us Buggy One and Explore.org for helping us pull this off. As always, we love all of our partners that help us bring polar bears to you. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon on the Tundra.